Germaphobe. My wife jokes that eventually living with me will be like living with Howard Hughes without the money. So she's a little worried, and she should be probably. But my proposal this morning is that we become the United Church of Christ presence in the Northern Plains. We're currently a presence in the Northern Plains. There's no doubt about that. And the Northern Plains are better off because we're here. I'm not arguing that at all. But when I say the presence of the Northern Plains, I think what I'm trying to say is that what if we became everything we're supposed to be? And when I think of something like that, it makes me think of a journey. If you look in the Bible, the examples of faithfulness often required people to make a trip, right? If Abram had not left his country to go far away to a land that he did not know, my guess is we'd never heard of him. He wouldn't have showed up in the Bible at all because he didn't go. The children of Israel, to get to the promised land, had to make a journey. And so journeys don't necessarily require you to physically leave, but what if we moved from where we are to where we're supposed to be? Now that immediately begs a bunch of questions. Which direction should we travel? Are we even willing to make a journey of any sort? Maybe more to the point, are enough of us willing to make this journey? Before I go any further, I'd just like to have a conversation about us, just for a moment. The United Church of Christ was built upside down on purpose. It may well be the most egalitarian organization in this country. It could very well be. And all the power in the United Church of Christ lies at the local church level. A UCC conference has just about no leverage on a church. You guys decide what you're supposed to do and be. And so I serve in this position at your pleasure. And whatever bishop authority I have, it's only because you lend it to me. And that's the nature of our relationship. And there are downsides to that. Sometimes when things get messy, it would be nice, for somebody to come in and say, okay, you sit over here and you sit over here and here's what we're going to do. But that's not the church that we belong to. That's not how that is. And so it does require us you have more responsibility. With power comes responsibility. And so it does require us to keep our heads, and maybe more than anything, it requires us to always tell one another the truth. So what would it look like if we became the United Church of Christ presence in the Northern Plains? Maybe for the remainder of my time, I would just throw out a few things to start that conversation. I would say first and foremost, our endeavors must be rooted in love. God is love. Joseph Campbell, a great mythologist, I don't know exactly what you would say his discipline was, but he studied ancient religions and was very famous. He's probably been dead for 30 years, I suppose. So we're talking about a little ways back. But he he studied all of these religions around the world and was considered an expert in that kind of stuff. And I ran across an interview of him on the internet, so this would have happened back in the 80s, I think. But he said in this interview that he really did not care much for the way we Western Christians practiced our faith. He said there's too much negativity, too much guilt. He said he most preferred the approaches in which people greeted one another as children of God, made in God's image. Gustav Gutierrez, the liberation theologian, said that God's love is gratuitous. And so we're painting a picture here of a God who loves indiscriminately and maybe even sometimes recklessly. And I don't know about you, but God has loved me recklessly any number of times throughout my life. Or I'm quite certain I would not be standing here. And I think we all have all experienced that. God's love and presence, even when we didn't deserve it. Jesus was a big love guy, which is why I wanted to read some of the Sermon on the Mount, a collection of Jesus' teachings. And in that, Jesus says, God causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Indiscriminately, right? Jesus approached situations in his life asking the question, most often, what is the most loving thing we can do here? And it caused him to break the rules. He was healing on the Sabbath. Weren't supposed to do that. His disciples were picking grain on the Sabbath. They weren't washing their hands, right? He was always on the wrong side of town with the prostitutes and the tax collectors and the sinners, and the good religious people were scandalized by that. But Jesus remained unflinchingly committed to doing the most loving thing. And over, he told these good religious people, you must do the most loving thing. And if your rules are getting in the road of that, then please set your rules aside for a minute and do what's right. Now, if Jesus were on earth today, we could be sure that he'd be on the wrong side of town with the wrong crowd, and the good religious people would be scandalized. And I don't think I need to remind you that you and I are always in danger of being these good religious people. Because after all, we're the ones who are here, right? We're showing up. And we would like for it to count for something. But the terrible truth is, in the final analysis, it really doesn't. Whatever we do, there's that parable Jesus tells about the servant, in which, and the servant, no matter what he or she does, only did the least they could do in response to God's love. I've come to believe that the phrase child of God may be one of the most powerful phrases in this world. Because as long as we remain children of God in each other's eyes, we will not be able to hurt each other. Almost impossible. We must first make one another something other or something less than a child of God. And then we can hurt each other. And, the truth is we do that all the time. Everyone is a child of God, made in the image of God, and it seems to me that nothing can undo that. The assertion that someone is no longer a child of God is just wrong. Now, I will allow that some of God's children may not be trustworthy enough to mind the store. Right? There are bad actors out there. All of that's true. But it seems that to me that nothing can stop someone from being a child of God. Poor people are children of God. And somewhere along the line, we decided that it was okay to be mean to poor people. Most of you are old enough to remember what I'm about to say. I think when I was young, the politicians would talk about the poor. But if you notice, they don't anymore. They really don't. They'll talk about the middle class. But it would seem now that if you fall below middle class, then you're on your own. If we just stood with the poor, we would transform the Northern Plains. I think we must be the driving force for ecumenism in this state, working with other denominations. And that's not really a very high bar, and the truth of the matter is we're probably already that. But we should not do it because we're small. We should do it because our openness is our greatest strength. And I think that's right. Our openness is our greatest strength. In our better moments, we know that we must make our mistakes, pitching the tent too big and opening the doors too wide. You can listen to stories, and I've heard these stories. No matter where you go in North Dakota, you'll hear people tell stories like this, that when no one would bury my loved one, like you could always go to the UCC church. Our openness is our greatest strength. And the hope of this world is the joint action of the faith community. And we should start by working on those things about which we agree. We decided on a couple of things, really at the last annual meeting. And one of those was the notion that we would seek reconciliation with our brothers and sisters. You hear it said, and I think it's true, that we are a divided nation. It appears to be getting worse. And for me personally, without reconciliation, I really don't see any way out of this mess. In fact, someone said, and I think it's probably right, that if we are either reconciled or we are at war. And as I look out across the landscape, just about any way you want to slice it, we're at war with each other. Now, to be reconciled is not to agree on everything. It's more about being willing to stay in the room, even though conflict would drive us apart. Reconciliation is about restoring friendly relations. We've reached the point where, I have 20 things here. I have a list of 20 things, and these are all important to me. And unless you agree with me on all 20 of these things, we can't work together. That appears a recipe for disaster to me. If there are 14 things about which we agree, let's pick one of those. It's about being willing to stay in relationship. I would tell you I tell you several stories, but I'll just tell one. Back early, this would be in the early 90s. We were in Pennsylvania, in a small town, which would probably be the 5th largest city in North Dakota. I don't know, but a town of about 10,000, I think. And in this town, there were, the good religious folk decided that they wanted to work on illegal drugs. But part of the reason that the church folk wanted to work on illegal drugs is that there were a bunch of halfway houses in this town where men who were recovering drug addicts were trying to get themselves back into society. So that was concerning and an undesirable element, and property values, all of that. People were concerned. But they decided they wanted to have a rally down at City Hall about illegal drugs, so I decided to go to these houses and invite these guys. And you know what happened? They all came. Just about all. It's probably 30 or 40 of, scattered in houses throughout the town. And they all showed up. Nobody was more anti-drug than these guys. My point is that we were together on that. And the whole problem of these halfway houses just suddenly went away. My experience has been that things happen in this world because of relationships, and relationships happen when people walk together far enough to do something good. And almost invariably, they want to do it again because it was good. We must begin talking to one another in meaningful ways. And we've developed a reconciliation workshop, which has gone amazingly well. If you're interested in it, let me know. It's just going very well. And it really is about listening to each other. And I've seen people who are clear across the room, they didn't leave agreeing with each other, but they were like this far apart at the end. Just because they listened to the other person. Being heard is a powerful thing. And we don't listen to each other, because whenever someone's talking, we're not listening to what they're saying. We're thinking up what our thing is going to be, right? What our response is going to be. The second thing I would lift up is that we must rebuild our local economies. We must start feeding ourselves again. Now, the argument against such a thing, is that it's too late. That the Buffalo Commons is our fate. You remember those people? Hopper, what was it? Popper? Remember their names? There were a couple. They were from the east there, and they came out here and they looked at North Dakota. Must have been in the early 90s, because we moved to North Dakota in 95. And this was pretty fresh when we first showed up. And so what they decided is that North Dakota was basically a lost cause, and we just ought to let it go back to the Buffalo. And the Buffalo Commons was, no one remembers that? Yeah. And people would talk about it. It was fresh. And they would talk about it and they would just spit, when they were talking. And which, as an outsider, I thought, if this was laughable, we'd just laugh it off. But I think, the problem is that they had hit a nerve. We were worried about our fate. But even if we believe that it's too late, it seems to me that does not relieve us of our obligation to try. Because if we abandon our rural communities, we leave them at the mercy of the forces that are tearing them apart now, and our rural areas will continue to empty out and more of our communities and our churches will die. You know, I came across a couple of statistics. In 1950, there were about 150 million people in this country, and 25 million of them were farmers. And then in, I don't remember what year this was, it was like one of those estimates, you know, since the last census, we'll say 2012. In 2012, there were 320 million people in this country, and how many farmers? I got to guess? 3.2 million farmers. Twice the population, and, you know. So, statistically, by percentage of the entire population in both cases, there are 94% less farmers in this country than there was in 1950. Now, that's a staggering statistic. And I'm not exactly sure what all of this looks like, but I am certain that we must figure it out. And that will require intentionality and courage. And the truth is, no one else is going to do it. I'm not talking about just us, but I'm talking about the faith community. I've been convinced for a very long time that if the faith community does not rescue the people, they will not be rescued in our time. I was at General Synod for the 50th anniversary of the United Church of Christ. It's in 2007. The United Church of Christ started in 1957. And it was a merger of the Congregational Christian Church and the German Evangelical and Reformed Church. They got together in the 50s. Most all of these churches up here were congregational churches. Started by missionaries, mostly from Connecticut. And if you remember your history, the Western Reserve for the people in Connecticut was Ohio. That was as far west as their imagination went. So this out here was a foreign country, really. I mean, and they sent missionaries out here. So we never had that many churches, you know, in the beginning. The immigrants who settled this land were Catholics and Lutherans, and you know, and they brought that over with them. The Congregationalists didn't move out here; they were already established back in New England. But well, that's who we are, and so they got together and they just called it the United Church of Christ. That's just what they called it. But I was at this celebration, and so they tried. It was the 50th anniversary, and they tried to find every famous UCC person they could find, you know, and they scraped together some people. We're not the most famous bunch in the country, it wouldn't seem. Barack Obama was UCC then, if you remember, in Chicago, and he was running for president, and so that was kind of a thing because the Secret Service, you know, he showed up and talked to us. But there was a fellow named Peter Gomes, and most of you may have heard of Peter. He ran the chapel at Harvard for a long time, and he was a scholar, and if you're a Christian scholar, you've probably heard of Peter Gomes. He gave a speech, and he was addressing the entire United Church of Christ at this meeting. And one of the things he said, you're small, and you're losing members. You guys should do something special just because no one expects it. No one's expecting anything out of you. You're deteriorating, you're getting old, you know, all of that. And it made me think, does anyone expect anything noteworthy to come out of the Northern Plains Conference from across the country? And the answer is no, they don't. But maybe that's reason enough for us to just decide to do something special. My friends, we're here today because we are called. We are called to be God's agents of healing and transformation. And I hope when we gather later this year at the annual meeting in Garrison, North Dakota, we will find ourselves on the path between where we are now and where we are supposed to be.